There is no such thing as a crap nap, I think the sleep training industry calls it. And that's this notion that if the nap is short or the nap is on the go, that it's not restorative. There's literally zero science to back that up. Zero. Like zero. So if you want to free yourself from bouncing or rocking or swaying in a dark room so that you can transfer your baby into a crib because you have to hit some perceived perfection of sleep, you can, like, permission to free yourself from that.
This is Raising Mama, a hilariously honest podcast dedicated to unveiling the hidden realities of motherhood.
Our goal is to arm you with the information and tools you need to be your most confident and empowered self.
This podcast is packed with unfiltered testimonies, diverse perspectives, and expert opinions, along with a good dose of laughter and tears.
Leading you on this journey is my best friend, Megan Stander, who is a CEO, passionate maternal health advocate, and mom of 2 daughters.
Alongside me is my best friend, Chelsea Ledson, who is a mother, wife, and registered nurse with her master's specializing in women's health. Let's try to raise the next generation
by raising up mamas
and maybe raising a little hell.
Hey, y'all.
Hey, mamas.
Welcome back to Raising Mama. On today's episode, we are tackling the dark side of sleep training with certified infant and family sleep specialist, Brittany Chambers. Brittany is the founder of Goodnight Moonchild and provides families an alternative to the classical sleep training model. Tune in today as we discuss how sleep training is actually a relatively new phenomenon that mostly occurs in Western society. You may not need to fight your natural instincts when it comes to sleep. Learn what has been working for centuries and the science behind how infants are naturally geared to sleep in the first place. Brittany will share what life is like from an infant's perspective. Welcome, Brittany.
Welcome, Brittany.
Hi, Chelsea. Hi, Megan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
It's good to have you. We're actually having you on. Full disclosure for everyone. This is the second time we're having her on. This is our re-record because we had some technical issues. So Brittany is kind enough to come on again, and we're gonna kill it. So, amazing bio. You do the most fascinating work.
Thank you.
And you're the first person that I've ever met that does this work. And now that the Instagram algorithm has kind of realized I'm into this stuff, I'm seeing a little bit more of it. That's how it works, right? I think for everybody that doesn't know what an integrative infant sleep specialist is, why don't you give us an explanation?
Sure. So I might even start by saying that the work that I do and the work that anyone that says that they work with babies and toddlers and kids pertaining to sleep, the work that we do is unregulated. So this term integrative infant sleep or infant sleep specialist or sleep coach or sleep consultant, they are just what they are. They're just terms and they don't have a governing body. There's no credentialing body. And I shared that as a primer for some of the things that we'll get into later. But my work and what I do and the way I was trained was looking at the whole human being and looking at who a baby really is. So I studied the neurobiology, the anthropology, the developmental psychology of infants and of the mother-baby dyad and the way that those two things interplay. So my work is grounded deeply in evidence-based practices. And then I also pull in energy work and I work with traditional Chinese medicine. I work with many different ancient wisdom traditions and techniques to try to get at the root if there is a problem or something going on with sleep that is beyond what is normal biological infant sleep. So that's what I do. I work with families all over the world and it is just such an honor. I love it so much.
You're like the big picture sleep specialist.
Yeah.
I love it.
Truly integrative, holistic.
I love that it's in like I have a very sciencey brain, and I love that, which is like, what does that even mean? Like sometimes the shit that comes out of my mouth, but I like it when I like knowing that science like back things, and I like looking at like evidence-based information. And you talk a lot about your work being informed by neuroscience, but that it's also focused on attachment. So why don't you tell us more about that? And like, what is the neuroscience? Like, let's get into the meat of it.
Oh, I love this so much because I think people just don't know. And why would you, right? Like this, it's not common knowledge. It's not been talked about commonplace. We don't have any models for it in media. Nobody's like making a sitcom on the neurobiology of infant sleep. So that would be cool. I would watch it. But basically, these little humans that are born with 25% of their brain volume. And so they're really born with massively underdeveloped brains. And
Mm.
that that evolved because we're bipedal animals and we have a narrower birth canal than other mammals. So if you think of like a giraffe or an elephant or a cow, they come out and like they can stand. I
Right.
don't know if that's true. I don't know if calves can actually fully stand. They're a little wobbly, I think, but like they have way more developmental capabilities, whereas newborn babies are totally defenseless. Really, like truly. We're
Hmm.
also a carrying species.
Mm.
So our evolved developmental niche is to be with our parents, to be raised with closeness and contact, to be held almost always. And that is the way that our brains evolved. So when infants are born, they cannot self soothe. They don't have the ability to go from a state of high stress to a state of low stress without an adult co regulating
Mm.
them.
Mhm.
They are basically born into the world with a super evolved primitive brain, but their emotional brain and their thinking brain, if you think of it as like three separate layers, are still developing, like still completely under construction. So babies don't have the brain power to use logical reasoning and be like, oh, it's bedtime. I should probably go to sleep right now. They need support, they need co regulation. And without going too deep into the science of it, the way that we build independence, the way that we build regulation is through repeated acts of dependence and repeated acts of co regulation. So when babies are alone, because they're these super primal beings, that sets off their alarm. Because being alone in our evolutionary biology would be a threat. Like
Right.
something is wrong if you're alone. And so they
Right.
signal, right? They signal for help. And if that call for help isn't met, they escalate. They escalate until they enter a freeze response and shut down, perhaps, right?
Mm.
But that is their design. Their design is to signal, their design is to be close. And so they're fighting for their survival when they are signaling and when they're left alone. And being alone in the vulnerable state of sleep, or at all, really is not normal or natural for a baby. So that's why it is so difficult to uh, parent a human baby in
Right.
modern society.
Right.
Totally. I remember last time you were basically saying like traditionally, sleep training is kind of anything that either disrupts or like is the intervention of doing what babies well, like we were saying that is biologically predisposed to do, which is to be cuddled, to be touched, to be sort of together with them. So, typical sleep training in my mind is like cry it out, or maybe you don't give them food right before bed, or it's like anything to kind of make it so that they can learn on their own how to go to bed without you. And I'm just so curious, like knowing that that's really not the capacity for a child at that point. Would you say there's a time where children do have that capacity? Is there a certain age? And if you maybe are, let's say the most extreme, what was it? Was it Ferber? Or who was the one?
The most extreme would be just like full on cry it out that comes
Yeah.
from a guy that wrote something in 1910 named Emmett
Okay.
Holt.
Oh, Emmett Holt. Yeah. So if you did, let's say, that most extreme method where you just put the baby down, close the room, and let them cry till they're exhausted underneath whatever the threshold, like what are the consequences of doing that?
This is a really important question because I feel like, and I don't think I said this last time we recorded. So here I am saying it this time because I think it's essential to give mothers their power back and say just like fully directly, if you choose to sleep train, like that is your choice. You are a grown woman. You can make that decision. But what's happening is parents are making decisions without information. So the answer to your
Right.
question, Chelsea, like nobody, okay, very few people are having these conversations in doctors' offices because pediatricians are not experts on infant sleep. They're not going to somebody that's studied the neurobiology, the attachment, the development, and being like, here, lay it out for me. What's the risk benefit here? And
Mm-hmm.
so nothing is deterministic, nothing is definitive because there's epigenetics and there's genetics that overlay on the experiences that we have, right? But what is possible, what the potential harm is that in this really crucial period of brain development, specifically the emotional circuitry. So, in this early infancy, what's happening is the brain is wiring itself for resilience, for compassion, for wellness. And to go like a little bit deeper, basically, the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex are not supposed to have this like super highway of on
Mm.
switches. And if you leave a baby alone to cry, there is a potential, like we've seen this in animal studies, the brains of babies that are responded to at night are markedly, not just like slightly, markedly different than the babies with brains who are not nurtured at night. What can happen is the babies who were left alone to cry can have very enlarged amygdalas. So they have hyperactive amygdalas. And we know from years of studying mental health that an enlarged amygdala puts you at risk of anxiety, of depression, of hypervigilance,
Mm.
right? We don't want huge amygdalas. And in
I
one
did not know
study,
that.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I didn't know that. It's interesting.
yeah, and we can, as adults, we can rewire our emotional brain through therapy, through so many different modalities, right? But it's work. We don't have to have our kids go through that process. Like this next generation doesn't need to undo anything. We can set them up from the beginning. And so if babies are responded to at night, they don't have, so again, not deterministic, but they have a much lower likelihood of having circuitry that's hypervigilant, of having circuitry that's overreactive, of
Mm.
basically what's happening is, to distill this down, right? They have an emotional brain and a thinking brain that become balanced. So they have a balanced brain instead of the scales tipping and having like hyperreactivity and or hypervigilance. So
So,
we want
like, because
balance.
I feel like most moms, again, I could be generalizing, but I feel like most moms don't do cry it out anymore. I feel like
Mhm.
that was like sort of a thing of like the 50s, maybe
You mean
I
our
don't
generation right now who's got a lot of
Like all of
anxiety
us.
and depression and everyone seems to be like
but yeah,
craving
I
therapy?
I
Giant
don't
amygdalas.
I'm sure it highly depends on like a lot of things, the statistics on this, but I do feel that most moms are not doing cry it out and they're switching to other more gentle methods. Like I myself, I did the verb, I think it was like the gentle cry it out. So it's like I come in every 2 minutes or something, I think was it the max. And then I would come in and I could be in there for 30 seconds, but I couldn't take the baby out of the thing because that would give it too much hope or something. And I did this as a first-time mom, not knowing the neuroscience, not knowing, thinking, "Oh, there's a word
Yeah,
gentle in it." But I have to tell you, it tore me apart. It also made my life a hell of a lot easier, but it tore me apart. So, I guess my question is for the other methods, like what does the neuroscience tell us there? Because there's a lot of content on Instagram saying that gentle cry it out is okay and almost telling you like you need to do this. You need to get your sleep. So there's pressure.
totally. I'm trying to resist saying that it's all bullshit, but I think it needs to be said
Mm.
because what the neuroscience says is everything I just said because it's still unresponsive care. Babies are signaling they're cueing and we're not responding in a cue based way, which is still sleep training. And I want to bring up, so Megan, can I speak really candidly despite you going through that experience? Like, does that feel okay? Do you have the
Yeah,
capacity for
totally.
that?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I just wanted to check in for that. And for anybody else, I think I said this last time, but for anybody else that's listening who's sleep trained, you don't need to turn this off because you did not do irreparable damage to your baby. We have very plastic brains and we can repair and we can heal. And if you just want to like take a breath and put a hand on your heart and acknowledge that you did the best you could with the information that you had, or the circumstances that you had, or the resources. I don't think anybody does this to be malicious. I think, to your point, Megan, like, we're inundated with information, and we also get this slant of like, oh, you need to do this or your kid's never going to be able to sleep. You need to teach them this skill. But here's what we know. My mentor, whose name is Dr. Greer Kirshenbaum, she's a neuroscientist. She wrote the book, The Nurture Revolution. She was asked a question like this recently on a podcast that she did. And she said that it's not definitive, but there's speculation that the gentle methods could actually be worse
Hmm.
because the parent is there, physically
Mm.
there. And the baby is like, I am right here. Where are you? Like, why are you not listening to me, but you listen to me during the day? Why suddenly do my needs not matter at night? Like, again, without a prefrontal cortex to understand what's happening, they can't make sense of that. And that could be incredibly damaging to the attachment relationship. I had a client, and in science we call this like n equals 1, right? Because it's
Mhm.
not more than one person's experience. But I had a client who called me to work with me after trying sleep training with her son, and she said what she observed was that he would disconnect from her during the day. He
Hmm.
stopped making eye contact with her. He seemed to be trepidatious around their engagement and their relationship. And her intuitive sense was like, something is happening here where he's learning to disconnect from me. So she wanted to do something different and wanted to have a conversation about informed consent in other ways. But yes, the other thing that I wanted to note on this front is that when babies are signaling like that, we can't translate their words into English, sorry, their cries into English. But what they are essentially saying, right, is, I need you. And so a lot of people will stop sleep training around the time that their baby is verbal because their baby starts saying things like, where are you? I need you. Mama, I'm scared.
So true. Oh my god, I can't even my almost 3-year-old told me, "Hold me." She said, "Hold
Oh,
me." And that was the only time I was ever on the precipice of just maybe leaving for 10 seconds with her. And I left and I was like, it was literally like 5 seconds and I came back and she told me, "Hold me." And I was like, "Nope, nope, 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 nope." I held her and in 5 minutes she was asleep.
so beautiful. And yeah, like, such a good representation of what's there always in their cries, because babies are communicating. Their cries are not protest cries. They don't have the ability to manipulate. They're just purely somatic beings. They're just trying to get their needs met, their survival needs, and they don't have a way of knowing that they are in a warm house in a bed.
Mhm.
They think they're alone. They think that they're in imminent danger. And what we're speculating, it's veering into actual evidence, but the only deductive reasoning that we have in scientific communities for what's happening in sleep training is that they're moving from this state of super high stress where they're thrashing or they're screaming or they're yelling, or in some cases, really awful things like vomiting. And then the body is like, okay, you need to conserve your energy. Nobody's coming. And they move into freeze response and they shut down. So they're not actually learning to fall asleep. And part of the evidence that supports this is that babies, if they then go on vacation or get sick and the parents come back and are responding, they instantly start signaling again. So they need to be retrained, right? Because it's nothing has been learned. They don't have the architecture to actually learn that skill yet. Sleep is also not a skill, but that's a separate
Is
topic. And
that
so,
what the regressions are then?
yeah,
And then you have to like redo it on the regression?
yes, yeah.
What age-ish is there any studies that say like when their brain, their emotional
Yeah, when
brain,
does it
like when
become
are they ready?
okay-ish?
Because
Oh yeah,
I
I didn't answer
definitely
your question.
know. Well, I was and anecdotally, I was gonna say I definitely know. Like now that my kid's older, right? Like sometimes you're like, okay, you're just, like you're just. I don't know. Like sometimes a kid cries and they really need you. Sometimes they cry and you're like, you're just messing with me right now. I don't know how to explain it. And
Mhm.
it's like, it's an easier way to communicate, like you said, where you're like, no, you can just, not have such an extreme. I don't know how to explain it. Is there a time where you can be a little bit more boundaries with them?
Yes. So in the first 3 years of life, because there's so much brain development happening and because they're still considered babies from a neurological standpoint, right? Like they don't have logical reasoning, they don't have the ability to manipulate. So it's less appropriate in that time. It's complicated though, because without knowing the specifics of what you're saying, Chelsea, like I think from my vantage point, I think anytime a baby is crying, 0 to 3, 0 to 5, even, right? Like anytime they're crying, they're communicating an unmet need, even
Mhm.
if we don't think it's a valid need. So
Mhm.
even if it's whining, like my daughter who's 3.5 loves to whine right now. Like that's her when she's in a dysregulated state, it comes out as whining.
Mhm.
And I find myself just as a human being quick to jump to like, oh my gosh, that's really dramatic, right? Like that's my dialogue in my head. But I'm aware that like in her world, whatever unmet need is creating the whining is actually like so real for her and is like an attachment need that needs to be met. So as that translates to sleep, I would say, and this is what I do when I work with people, you can make parent led changes at any point, really, because people have different circumstances, right? And you can make parent led changes that are based in neuroscience and attachment and that don't compromise those things.
Mhm.
But in order to really respect where the brain is and do boundaried nighttime sleep where you're doing like separation bridging or you're doing social stories to help like orient the kid at night, I would say around 2.5, that becomes more developmentally appropriate.
Yeah, that's where I've kind of she's about 2, a little over 2.5, and, like, right now, I'm like, I don't know, I can tell sometimes she's just, like, testing something, and then she'll just like,
Mhm.
"Okay," and then move on. Whereas, you know, whereas if I, like, really take all this time and make it a whole thing, it's like she's just I don't know. But I also think it took 2.5 years of us having a relationship where I can kind
Yeah.
of navigate those nuances. And then what you really are making me think about, so this is just me, and maybe I'm not like the average woman, but I work full time, I
Mhm.
work night shift, right? And I am blessed, beyond blessed, that I have like a 3 adult household, like an abuelita and a husband, and lots of support at home. But I definitely feel like even if I knew I didn't know before, but with my second kid, if I know that like the very best thing for my baby is to respond to every cry all the time, my two biggest roadblocks is number one, sometimes I just don't have it in me, you know?
Mhm.
Like like I'm like, I want to respond to you, but like I can't. Like I need
Mhm.
to sleep, regulate myself, like chill out. And part of me feels like that had to be happening back in the caveman days where like somebody was just like, okay, like I think maybe there's a certain amount of not responding that just naturally happens. But then I think, oh, well, maybe in the caveman days there was like a tribe of 20 people and somebody picked
Totally.
the kid up.
Yeah.
So it's like we live in this modern age where it's super unlikely to have 3 adults. It's like you got to go back to work. In California, you get 6 months maternity leave, which is crazy long, but in most states, it's 6 weeks unpaid. And, you know, if you work night shift, like I'm not there at night. And
Mhm.
it's like, I don't know how to assimilate this knowledge that most likely responding to your kids cry every time is what's really helpful for them, but knowing like it doesn't translate into the world I live in.
Yeah.
How could I bridge those gaps or make some compromises to be better attentive to my kid like the second time around?
You articulated that so beautifully. It's something that I write about and talk about a lot, especially in smaller containers when I can speak specifically to somebody's life and help them troubleshoot and figure out how we can move pieces around so that nighttime care is responsive. And to pause and say, perfection is never the goal.
Mhm.
The attachment relationship doesn't need every cry to be responded to all of the time perfectly, right? 70% of the time is what most of the research cites to create like a secure attachment. The babies need to know that their needs will be met and that they have a responsive caregiver as their primary attachment figure, right? But like perfection is not the goal. I also think that when we think about the systems that we live in and the number of people that have to go back to work within 2 weeks, for example,
Mhm.
have to go back to work the next day, I've encountered. That's real. Like, this
Mhm.
is real for some people, right? who is taking care of their baby and what's their capacity. So what I like to say when I'm talking to people about this is two things. Thing one is I think where and when we can, if we have the privilege to, we need to advocate for mother-centric policies at work. I
Mm.
have seen so much pushback to this. Every time I say this to a client, they're like, I can't talk about it with my boss, even if my boss is a woman with kids. And I would just invite you, if you're listening and that came up for you and you're like, I cannot do that. I think you can in most positions of any privilege. If you are hired, you are working for your employee, for your employer, you have value. It takes so much to fill a position, even in our economy, even in the world that we live in right now. Retention is always more efficient than rehiring. And as a woman who is listening to this in a post COVID world when so many corporations, so many companies had to shift to be remote, you can absolutely carve out some flexibility in almost every case. It's a little bit different if you're physically going to a job site or if you have, if you're a teacher, for example, or a nurse, Chelsea, right? Like there's a little bit less flexibility there. In those cases, I do so much work with women on widening their window of tolerance in their nervous systems because we can't regulate our kids if we're dysregulated. It just isn't possible. Our kids are mimicking the state of our nervous system. And if we are on overload, if our sensory system is on overload because we've been fielding cries or screams or whatever all day, it's also really hard to respond if you're in that state.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that's what you referenced, Chelsea. So I do a lot of work guiding people back to a place of resource, being resourced. Yeah, being resourced. And it doesn't need to look like going to like a sauna and a cold plunge down at the new fancy spa. Like you can do a 5-minute breathwork sequence that actually calms your heart rate down, puts you back in parasympathetic, and gives you like a little bit of space between your thought and your reaction to like show up for your kid in a different way. And this translates to the night because of many things. But thing one is you're not waking and like going into sympathetic overload. You're waking and you're like, okay, my kid's crying. They need me. I'm going to meet their need and I can fall back asleep and it's not the end of the world. I think there's a lot of catastrophizing about our own sleep and a lot of a lack in perspective that this is just a season always. It's just a season. And our bodies, our brains as mothers are actually built to have different sleep patterns in the early years and our brains and our bodies adapt to that and it's not harmful to us. The other thing I want to say in response to your question like how do we translate this to the real world is setting up safe sleep environments to get your kids in your proximity. If you don't want a bed share, don't. That's fine. If you do want a bed share, you can do it safely. It is very simple to be done safely. There's a resource on Instagram called Co-Sleepy, at Co-Sleepy. She has a million free resources on how to set up your room or your sleep space to be safe for bed sharing. If that is not what works for you, you can co-sleep, meaning your baby can be either next to you in like a sidecar bassinet, or you can have their crib in the room with you. And if you do that, you are expending a lot less energy. You're waking up a lot less because you're in the same proximal space. We know that parental proximity also can reduce night wakes. So we think a lot like, oh my gosh, we're going to lose out on sleep if we have our kid in our room with us or our kid in our bed with us. And the data shows that not only do bed sharing breast sleeping mothers get just as good of sleep as people that do not have that set up, but there's evidence
Mm.
that they actually get more sleep and that it's more restorative. So keep in mind, this is our evolutionary design. So it doesn't need to be a thing. Like you can just, like one possibility, right? I have a 3.5-year-old, like I mentioned, and I have a 6-month-old. I have him in bed with me. We breastfeed as we sleep. I rouse slightly when he latches to nurse, and then I go right back to sleep. In 6 months, I've not left my bed at night. That could be a possibility.
So another thing that I love it when you that I've heard you talk about is throwing out your previous notions of what sleep is supposed to be like.
Yes.
And this kind of ties in with the next question, which was that do you think that the more Western notion of sleep training is conditioning parents to not trust their instincts? But I also think that the Western notion of sleep training and just infant sleep in general is teaching us like how infants need to sleep, where they need to sleep, what the patterns look like. And I love just seeing your videos of like you baby carrying and your baby sleeping. And it's like, this is okay. That sleep looks like this. But like,
Yes.
tell us more about that.
Oh, my favorite topic in the world. I'm making a t-shirt right now that says naps in the wild because also I've realized this has been co-opted by hikers, and hikers are like, can I get one of those? I'm like, no, this is for babies. This is not for you. But
I would
yeah,
advise you to say yes to that.
no, but
Run
the
with it.
naps in the wild, that's the ethos of what I really want to convey. Naps do not need to look like a dark room with blackout shades, with a sound machine, with a schedule, with a sleep sack. No, you need none of those things actually. If you want them, that's fine. I like, this is not even a raising mama plug. I like really cute pajamas. It's like cute and sweet. And I have all these photos of my daughter in like these really sweet pajamas. But she's in the pajamas or my son's in the pajamas on the rep anywhere I am in the world. And that can be really restorative sleep. There is no such thing as a crap nap, I think the sleep training industry calls it. And that's this notion that if the nap is short or the nap is on the go, that it's not restorative. There's literally zero science to back that up. Zero, like zero. So if you want to free yourself from bouncing or rocking or swaying in a dark room so that you can transfer your baby into a crib because you have to hit some perceived perfection of sleep, you can, like, permission to free yourself from that. You can go throw your baby in a wrap and walk around your neighborhood or walk by the beach or walk in a park. And that is a totally restorative fine nap. Like I said in the beginning, we're a carrying species. You can have fun with it. You could let it be light. You can know that if they wake up because their older sibling is loud, it's okay. Babies' brains will take the sleep they need when they need it. Our brains are brilliantly designed to do so. We are social mammals. We lived in loud and boisterous settings. Sleep wasn't like this really sacred, like hush thing. Babies slept on their moms' backs whenever they were tired, and then they woke up whenever they were awake.
I can imagine it would be hard to transition, like, say maybe your baby's 6 months and you did the whole, like, blackout room noise machine thing. I can imagine it'd be, like, hard to then kind of transition them into, like, a carrying napper because, like, even now, like, my kids it kinda sucks, honestly. Chelsea did it the right way. I followed all the rules, I followed the guides and whatever, but, like, dude, my kids need a sound machine and a blacked out room to sleep
I hear
now.
this all the time.
Still, they're 4.5 and almost 3.
Mhm.
The other night, my washing machine was running, and my 3-year-old, I don't know if she's ever acknowledged the sound machine ever. Like, they've never asked me what it is, but they know it goes on. She's never acknowledged it, and she just started yelling at me to make it louder, and I was like, "What is going on?" I was like, "Do you want me to turn the laundry machine off?" She's like, "No, that thing. Make it louder." And I'm like, "Okay." It was so loud. I was like, "More?" She's like, "More." And what I think she wanted is she wanted it to be louder than the noise coming from outside, but she didn't know how to say, "No, it's actually just loud outside." Because
Yeah,
it's like 7:30 at night, like, there's still motorcycles and whatever. But
totally.
anyways, so, like, just shows you the dependence that she has on it,
Yeah. These
and
are things that
they
are
can't
not
nap in the
talked about.
car, they can't
Yeah.
nap anywhere.
Or
It's
like
annoying.
I napped at the beach with my son this weekend, and I thought about that because I've had many clients that have shared this with me, and they're like, "Can I untrain them?" Well, yeah, of course. Like, of course you can. And also, whatever is whatever feels good in your body, I would say, is what you could consider the path for you. Like there are no shoulds, and I think that I hope I communicated the science really clearly. Like, we know that responding to your baby day and night is crucially important for their emotional, mental, physical, spiritual well being. And within that, like within those parameters, right? Like you can, that doesn't mean you can't do crib naps and still be a responsive nighttime parent. Like you can still nurture and do naps in the crib. So temperament overlays, like every single baby is different. What I really just want to make crystal clear is that you don't need to train them. You don't need to teach them. Sleep, solo sleep will unfold naturally because it's a developmental milestone. It does not
Hmm.
need to be taught. And my daughter is a great example of this. I wore her, or she was on my body for every nap for the first 15 months of her life. And then me or somebody in my family, one of her caregivers, she was on us, and needed really, really high contact. She was a very sensitive baby and needed the constant sensory stream that was my body, that was like her safety. And we breastfed and co-slept, and she was in bed with me all night. And then around 2.5 years, she started like rolling away and taking a little bit of space and then taking a little bit more space. And by the time that she was somewhere between 2.5 and 3, she started asking me to leave the room so that she could go to sleep by herself. She started asking. and
Hmm.
and that's because she had a relationship to sleep that was built on safety and security. She doesn't know to be scared of being solo because there's nothing deep in her brain saying you need to signal, you need to freak out, because her needs have always been responded to at night. My son, by contrast, same parenting style, right? Like he's been nurtured at night his whole life. He will happily sleep off of me. He has a different stress system than her, right? So that
Hmm.
doesn't mean I'm not taking a nurturing approach with him. It just means he's a different baby and there's a different thing that's working for him. It's all about tuning into your baby and providing care that's based on their cues.
Here's my last question, because you're talking about siblings a lot.
Sure.
Is there an age where, like, well, or I guess you're just tuning into your baby, but sleeping with multiple kids in one room, that sounds very stressful to me.
I think it's been really fun.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
do it.
Megan
I love
doesn't.
Stressful
it.
how?
I do it every night.
Me
I
too.
mean, again, I'm a night shift nurse, so I feel like if when I'm sleeping, it's during the daytime, and so I need extreme aids. I need the blackout curtains. I need, like,
Totally.
it's hard to sleep in the day, and, like, I don't know. It just, to me, I'm
But I
like,
guess for you, you're more asking, like, if I were to start sleeping
yeah,
at night in the normal at night
right,
way with my kids all
yeah,
in the same.
Right. How would you do it? Is that your
yeah,
question?
yeah. That's my question.
Yeah. How to do it safely just depends on your kid's age, the bed setup. One safe option is to have the younger baby in cuddle curl with the mom. So, cuddle curl is how I would recommend sleeping. This is not a recommendation from me. It's not my term. It's used predominantly by James McKenna, who's a researcher at the University of Notre Dame, who's been studying mother baby sleep patterns for like 45 years. And he has endless research on his website. He also wrote a book on sleep, Safe Sleep. It's just called Safe Sleep. It's phenomenal. And it will walk you through all of that. But one way is to use that, how do I say this? It's like a pattern that he observed naturally happens in every co-sleeping dyad. A dyad is a mother and a baby. And it's that instinctively the mother curls her body in the shape of a C around her baby, and the baby hones into the mom's breast because that is their home, literally. It's their nourishment. And in that setup of the mom in the C curl with the baby, there's all of these facets of biobehavioral synchrony that happen in that protective setup where there's like heart coherence and brain coherence, and the mother's body regulates the baby's breathing. It's protective against SIDS. This is like well documented.
Hmm.
So that is called breast sleeping. And that's what, so if you've got multiple kids, you'd be in that shape, the cuddle curl with one kid. And then your partner would be next to you. And then on the other side of the bed would be your other kid. And then
Hmm.
theoretically, if you've got like a third kid or a fourth kid, you could have another bed in the room that they're either sharing or that they're in individually, depending on how your room setup is. And
Hmm.
I found, and most people have found that are doing this, like bed sharing with a younger baby and a toddler, is that there's a little bit of an adjustment period depending on the temperament of the older kid. And then the noise, if any, that the younger kid makes kind of falls into the background. My daughter
Mm.
is super sensitive, as I shared, and my son is not sensitive. But when he was really, really new, he's still really new, but when he was like a newborn, he was crying and making noise at night, and she would continue to sleep super soundly and not even stir after the first couple of days, which I think, I don't know, I haven't looked at the data on this, but I would attribute to the fact that we're social mammals and we've always slept
Totally.
together.
That's probably how we've been doing it for a long,
Yeah.
long time.
For me, my kid, there was a learning period because I don't know, they had to kind of learn how to sleep parallel to people. And I also have had to give people advice, and I'm like, do not be afraid to spatula your kid into the place or position you would like them to sleep in so
Totally.
that you can be more comfortable. Be assertive of your space and the space that you need. I am not a cuddler. I don't like people touching
Mhm.
me. I have, but I have also changed. I can accept more of it now. Like I
Yeah.
can have some touching. I was just getting used to it. And then also like I'm just assertive. I'm not gonna if I'm not comfortable, I'm not gonna suffer. Like I'm moving you. And
I've done I've
you're
done that so many
tiny.
times, like scooping my daughter up and sliding her over. She never, like, totally limp, doesn't even notice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Doesn't
And
wake them up.
and
Like,
this is an important point, I think, to say that, like, everybody has their own sensory sensitivities or sensory preferences, even as adults. And so I work with people that are like, I cannot bed share. And I'm like,
Mm.
cool, don't. You don't need to
Yeah.
bed share to be adhering to like principles of,
Being responsive.
yeah, yeah. They're not mutually exclusive that way.
Totally. Oh man, Brittany, I feel like we could literally talk for another 10 years because every time we discuss stuff, I learn a bunch. I'm sure a ton of people learned a lot today. I know that if people want to know more about you, they can totally check out your Instagram at Goodnight Moonchild and peruse all your sleep packages that you offer on goodnightmoonchild.com. But I also know that you are kind of all about like people empowering themselves and
Yeah.
kind of learning more about the subject. Are there any like two main books that you'd be like, if you're interested in this at all, you should read X? Like, what would you recommend?
Yes. So the first is the book that I referenced earlier called The Nurture Revolution. There's like an evidence stack this big at the back of references and citations. And it's one of those books that I think should be like a prerequisite to parenting. And also, even if you don't have kids, it's so
Mm,
healing because it explains, I think, explains part of why we are societally where we are right now. And I feel like
mm,
it gives tremendous hope for the trajectory that we're going because people are waking up to the realities that, and the reality, right, is that for the last 100 or so years, we've been engaged in this experiment that is sleep training. This is not our biological norm. This is a largely Western construct. There are countries that are floored that we sleep train in the West. They think it's completely mind blowing and shocking. And we're doing this based off of one guy's advice that was not grounded in evidence, that was trying to make a recommendation based on what was called germ theory at the time, that is extremely outdated. It was never based in science, but everything that surrounds sleep training has been massively debunked and we move on from, but we like still retain this one thing. And I think it's because of what Chelsea touched on. We live in a hyper individualistic, capitalistic society that is anchored in the patriarchy. And so it's really, really difficult to parent this way.
I have one last question.
Sure.
What would you tell a sleep trainer? Like
ooh.
if like what
What would I tell a sleep
there's
trainer?
big ones that we but like what advice would you give them?
I'd say I would,
He'd be like,
I
read the
would,
book.
yeah, I would urge them to. Okay, here's what I would really say. I've got one in my mind, who I would just love so badly to sit down to coffee with. I would first tell them not to be scared that everything they've worked for will crumble. I think that sleep trainers too are entrenched in a capitalistic society. I think it's really scary to open your mind to new information when your entire paradigm and worldview has been one thing, especially because if you're a sleep trainer and you've got kids, you've probably sleep trained your kids. So this is really confronting, really, really confronting. So I'd urge them to like sit in silence with themselves. And like, if they're a person who meditates, however they want to connect with their heart, and ask them to just take a breath and think about themselves as a baby, and throw all the science out for a window just for like 1 minute. Just throw it out the window and ask how they would want to be treated. And then once they did that little somatic practice, I would love for them to read The Nurture Revolution, to look at Dr. Helen Ball's work. She's the leading researcher on SIDS. I would ask her to look at Gabor Mate's work, to look at Gordon Neufeld's work, to look at the science of attachment and of the developing brain, and then to come out on the other side with even just some questions.
That's interesting.
Pretty solid advice.
Yeah, and Chelsea, I realized I didn't answer the second part. So the one was the book. The second part is, you'll have to fact check me to make sure I'm getting this right. It's called BASIS. It's the Baby and Sleep Information Source. It's through Durham University in the UK. And it's this massive free resource of anything and everything you could want to know about sleep training. It has like a consolidated analysis of the studies we have on sleep training. It's conducted again by a university. It's totally unbiased. And the purpose of it is to give parents informed consent. And I think it's basis.co.uk.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. So we'll drop all the links to the books, the resources that you've mentioned. We'll put everything in the podcast description, including links to Brittany's Instagram so you can follow her, and her website so you can check out her work and maybe even book a session with her. And thank you so much for coming on the show again. It was fascinating. We love talking to you, and we can't wait to maybe have you back again one day.
This was such a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for your bravery. Truly.
Yeah.
I appreciate you two so much.
Oh, thank you. You really are a great educator, and you're so well read, and it's so fun to learn new things.
Thanks, Chelsea. I appreciate that.
Thank you for tuning in to the Raising Mama podcast. Your presence means a lot, and we hope you found our discussion insightful.
To become a part of our community, follow us on Instagram at Raising Mama Podcast. Explore resources on the Raising Mama Village located at www.raisingmama.com.
You're never alone on this motherhood journey. We're here to support you every step of the way.